as the Senior Vice President for Values, Ethics, Social Responsibility, and Pastoral Services since 2000. Our Ethics Center actually sits in his division, so we get to report to him as well. He has served many years in hospital chaplaincy, clinical pastoral education, and then in administrative positions in Texas and in Indiana. He has both a master's degree and a PhD in theology from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And I often say that this topic is the third rail of ethics, so nobody has been willing to touch it in ethics for a long time. I think mostly because people feel that they can't say anything that will lead anywhere. But we're going to have a quiet discussion, I think, today about it. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Steve.
Thank you, Paul. Good noon to all of you. I trust that you have arrived today with some sense of equanimity, and that over the next 45 minutes or so I will be able to disturb that a bit. And that is only slightly, wait a minute, going the wrong way here. That's only slightly untrue. This has a context, and you need to understand the context for the why now. IU Health and its predecessor organizations, Clarion, and before that, the separate hospitals in the academic health centers, we now call it, have all provided pregnancy terminations under certain conditions. However, during the summer of this past summer, with new legislation that put in place in Indiana, certain financial controls over pregnancy termination, and certain controls over physicians about what they must say and must do regarding pregnancy termination. Issues again arose within us and among us that needed to be addressed on how would we proceed ethically, morally, as a community of trust and respect at IU Health. I was thus pulled into a conversation that I did not seek, but I'm glad that I'm in the midst of today. So that's the conversation that we're a part of and where that leads us. The tensions and practice patterns require ongoing work. So what am I trying to accomplish here today? Well, I want to help create respect for differences. We are going to differ, period. I cannot change that. I have no desire to change that. But I do hope that we can have an understanding of common ground where we do have common ground, and rather than polarized opinion which drives us either into silence or into conflict, that we make it okay to have conversation regarding pregnancy termination and the differences that we have. It is my goal that we make it not okay under any condition to disrespect each other because of these differences or to disrespect patients who have choices to make. It should under no circumstances be okay to disrespect each other. I want to explore the moral context for IU Health. That includes both secular roots and religious roots of who we are. And I hope that during this time you will deepen your own moral commitments, whatever that stance may be, and that perhaps it will be a chance for your conscience to be just a little bit pricked around your own responsibilities in issues regarding pregnancy termination. Being a good ethicist, at least occasionally, I want to give you informed consent, and that is, if you do not want to deal with your own conscience today, now is the time to leave. Okay? If you stay, something happened? Is it back on? Is it back on? Says it's on. Okay. Is this one on? Well, those of you who know me know I like to wander, and so this is going to be uncomfortable. For me, not for you. So, if you do not wish to deal with your own conscience today, now would be a good time for you to leave. If you stay, you have given your consent to have your conscience messed with just a little bit. What am I going to talk about? This is the outline for today. This are the chapters that we will be walking through. So, we have several key statements. I want to underline these and then turn to the ethical basis for these statements. First of all, I need to remind you of the governance that we have. Governance is one of those highfalutin words that most of us in this room are lucky enough not to need to pay attention to. I have to occasionally. In the way we are governed as an organization, we have two key stakeholders. One is Indiana University. The other is the Methodist Health Group. Those are important to recognize. We are a church-state partnership. That doesn't exist very much in the United States. It does for us. How is this actually expressed? To be a member of the board of directors of IU Health, the Methodist Health Group gets one vote, and the board of trustees of Indiana University gets one vote, and with each of those, you become a member of the board of trustees. It's a joint selection process. Methodist Health Group is chosen by the University of Indiana, the board of trustees, through the state appointment process. We also have standing members of the board of directors. The CEO of IU Health is a standing member, the dean of the medical school is, and the bishop of the Indiana Conference of the United Methodist Church is. At a governance level, we look both to secular state roots and to specific religious roots for our governance and our identity and our core reason for being. We then have expressed 7 core values that should be consistent with our positions and our policies regarding most of the all of the ways that we do procedures and all of the ways that we have core expression of who we are. Each of these get involved in one way or another in the process of policies and procedures and practices regarding termination of pregnancy. There are then 2 key policies in the Academic Health Center, and let me pause to note that for those of you in other locations, you may have similar policies to these, but they may not be identical. One of the things that we're doing at this time is reviewing all of our policies regarding pregnancy termination to ensure that they are as consistent as they need to be to serve the needs of our patients wherever they are in the system. The policy in the Academic Health Center around pregnancy terminations says that A, we provide pregnancy terminations for medical indications in accord with state and federal law. 2, or B, we ensure accurate and full physician consultation, personal counseling resources, and when appropriate, genetics counseling resources to all patients involved in pregnancy termination decisions. And C, we schedule these procedures as best we can to accommodate staff requests to not participate in such procedures based upon matters of conscience. It's a longer policy than that, but those are the 3 core provisions. A part of this that you may have caught as I read those rather quickly was the matter for matters of medical indication. That is a term of art, not a term of science, nor a term of law. It is a term of art that focuses upon the relationship between the patient and the patient's physician. It's where matters of medical indication are primarily discussed and when there are issues that may go elsewhere. We have a second policy that has to do with staff requests involving cultural, ethical, or religious concerns that basically says that if your conscience says, I cannot participate in that activity, I can request not to participate. And if requested, your supervisor will evaluate A, will the patient's care be negatively impacted if you do not participate? B, your request not discriminate against a patient. If all of those are answered in a positive way, then your request will be granted. Though there is an evaluation process, I would want to be clear that I am not aware of any occasion in my 11 years here where a person requested conscientious relief from participating in any procedure and did not receive it. So we have been very fortunate in being able to actualize that. Now, where do those policies come from? That's the core of what I want to talk about today. First, I want to talk about our secular moral context, based in our state university affiliation, based in our health professions, which live in a pluralistic and secular environment. Most of you in health professions have licensure to participate in medicine from where? Where do you get your licensure? From the state. You are state licensed to practice your profession. There are also laws that guide, and these laws at least should be based upon public benefit and the public good, not upon private opinion or religious doctrine. So, what does the public think? This is a Gallup poll that has been done for over 30 years now that asks the question, do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances, legal only under certain circumstances, or illegal in all circumstances? The top line is those who say it should be legal under certain circumstances. The middle line, under all circumstances, and the bottom line, never. Illegal under all circumstances. Two things I want to call your attention to here, that from the veracity of the public debate, you might think, gee, these lines must be most of everybody. Please note, most of everybody says, you know, this is a difficult moral choice and there is a middle ground here. That's what most people believe. The veracity of the public debate has to do with the smaller piece. The second thing I would call your attention to is that all of these lines for 30 years have been essentially flat. Little peak here, little peak there, they're flat. People are not changing their minds. Doesn't matter how much public discourse there is that is mean, is evil, and sometimes dangerous. People are not changing their minds. Now, a poll does not establish what is ethical. I am thankful for that, by the way. Polls do not establish what is ethical. But they do challenge us to say, well, what is the public focused on? Well, what is the public focused on in the public arena? We have 4 core medical ethics. This is known, and those of you who have done any study at all recognize these 4 words, sometimes known as the Georgetown mantra, because leaders at Georgetown University School of Medicine and ethics there popularized these into a kind of code. Non-malfeasance or non-maleficence is an ancient doctrine going back over 3,000 years in medical ethics history that basically says the physician, the healthcare provider, will do no harm. It's a very old. Beneficence has been stated right alongside that one to say it is our obligation to do good. That one actually emerged a little bit slower because for centuries it was a lot easier for healthcare providers to do harm than it was to do good. That's just historically true. Nevertheless, those two are both ancient. Concerns for justice emerged a little bit more recently as actions, access, equality of access, benefit to resources have become more important. This is the public ethic. And then finally we have this 4th word, autonomy. Autonomy has emerged as an issue in medical ethics only since the middle of the 18th century. In terms of philosophical and religious discourse, only yesterday did autonomy even become a substantive point of discourse, and thus the issue in our policies today. Autonomy emerges politically in the second half of the 19th century and becomes key principle in medicine only in the second half of the 20th century. Up until the 50s and 60s, physicians would make decisions on what was best for patients. It would be done. For persons doing medical experimentation, informing the subjects of those experiments of what was going on was just simply considered unnecessary. It wasn't they were being mean. It was unnecessary. We never considered that a research subject has autonomous decision. So this, until the second half of the 20th century, was not even a principle that medical ethics seriously considered. Where did this principle come from? The Enlightenment is where this principle came from. Now, I know for some of you, you're dragging, oh my gosh, he's going way, Enlightenment is not that old. The Enlightenment was expressed the notion that pluralistic, non-religious determined state is the ideal political structure for humanity. It is in a pluralistic, non-religious state that personal choice and personal fulfillment can be achieved. That's the core message of the Enlightenment. It came out of the 17th and 18th century movements in Europe, which were based upon the civil wars of Europe that were religiously based and decimated Europe for 2 centuries. I would remind you, if you're not making a connection here, that during the middle phase of the Iraq War, when the Sunnis and the Shia were at each other's throat in Iraq, and we scratched our head and said, how could a civilized society do that to each other? If we just knew our history, we would know we are not that far as Christians from doing that to each other. And those who paid attention to what happened between England and Northern Ireland would suggest that even into the 20th century, we are not that far. The Enlightenment comes out of a period of religious war. And they basically said, we will not base our states on religion anymore, but we will base it upon a philosophy and culture that is respectful of differences and allows for individual fulfillment. Key names you would recognize from this period would be John Locke, Voltaire, and Isaac Newton. Within the United States, or the colonies at this point, key names that represented the Enlightenment perspective, among others, would be Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. It's important for my point about secular and state university to talk just a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. When asked what his greatest achievements were and what he wanted to have remembered and thus put on his tombstone, Jefferson named 3 achievements of his life. 1, the Declaration of American Independence. And by the way, how does the Declaration of Independence begin? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. A wonderful expression of Enlightenment philosophy. The second thing he said was that he was proud of the statue in Virginia for religious freedom. That's the second item on his tombstone. Virginia had been an Anglican-controlled government. He was proud to establish religious freedom and to write the laws that instituted that in Virginia. The third item was that he was the father the leader of the University of Virginia. Come on, a graduate of the University of Virginia should know that. Nah. He was not proud of his kids, apparently. And as we know from history, a couple of those are rather controversial children. But the point is, the founding of the state university, it is my understanding, and I would welcome a correction to this because it's not a point of scholarship for me. It is my understanding that the University of Virginia was the first university founded in the world separate from religious control. It was the first secular university founded in the world. That is my understanding. If someone has a correction to that, really, I would welcome it. That way I won't say falsehood again. So, State University rooted in Enlightenment principles, and that has been the tradition of state universities to this point. That is our tradition. Now, one person to say some specific things about related to the Enlightenment. The philosopher upon whom much of 20th century philosophy and ethics hinges is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant said the center of personhood is the power of reason to achieve both scientific and moral ends. Reason, not revelation, and not authority are the guide to the conscience. That's the core of what he says. So, what's the key gain here? Individual autonomy to decide one's own life course is at the core of human development. Recognize that all persons do live in communities, but that no religious authority, no communal authority should have control of any individual conscience. Thus, came to the public square rather than to reveal truth or religious authority in order to establish the life of the whole community. Now, just to give you a sense of this, in the United States, what do we say to certain sects who refuse to salute the flag? We excuse them from those activities and ask them not to disrupt the rest of the community. What do we say to those who disdain violence to the extent that they refuse to bear military arms? We provide conscientious objection, and by the way, service, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more later. We have ways to bear extreme dissent in our communities without violence and without harm to individual conscience. There's bound to be a way to figure that out in relation to abortion as well. We accept private differences. We seek to accommodate private differences in the public square, and the greatest extent possible we seek to maintain autonomy. Now, some would argue that our contemporary emphasis on autonomy, the you can be whatever you want to be argument, is really wrong-headed. They might argue that there is a religious authority that limits our choice as individuals. They might argue that one's community has more claim on individual choice than the individual has. They might claim that only white males who own property and have no debts are the only men who can make independent decisions for self and community, which the U.S. Constitution did for a period of years. But the trend of our culture for 300 years now is toward ever more personal choice and personal freedom. In relationship to abortion, that interpretation was certainly established in law by Roe v. Wade. So the secular controversy involves questions such as, does the autonomy of the mother have control over the autonomy of the unborn? Is it logically coherent to even speak of the autonomy of the unborn, and if so, in what way? Does the presumed father have any autonomy in relation to the unborn, and if so, in what way? These questions, of course, cannot be removed from the fact that until relatively recent in the West, women have had little to no autonomy in relation to any part of their life, with the possible exception of the most private and personal parts. Thus, those who argue for radical autonomy of the woman in relation to both man and child are expressing autonomy that many find uncomfortable and find uncomfortable even apart from abortion decisions. When you combine a feminist perspective and a feminist understanding of life with abortion, it becomes even more difficult to understand for those who look to other authority for their own guidance. Some scholars would argue that society must honor this emerging autonomy of adult women because of past oppression. Others would argue that such a position trivializes one of the core basic facts of human existence. At least as of today, women bear children, and there is no other way for children to come into this world. Women's autonomy is thus hedged by a fact of nature, apart from whatever social limits women may experience. I'm trying to go through with you and help prompt your own thinking on where in this conversation do you find yourself? Where do you find yourself in relation to autonomy and the various parts of autonomy that happen? Now, this sense of autonomy has been then buried into various of our professional ethical statements. This professional statement is from the Code of Professional Ethics of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. I suspect most of you have codes which include much of this same language. Let me just highlight for you. The patient-physician relationship is the central focus of ethical concerns, and the welfare of the patient must form the basis of all medical judgments. Sit with that one just a moment. Where is the center? The OB/GYN should serve as a patient's advocate and exercise all reasonable means to assure that appropriate care is provided. Once again, for those of you in professions, your professional code is going to have something similar to those comments. So what's the ethical result of this? From our secular state base, from that side of our governance, we emphasize patient autonomy within the limits of the law and professional autonomy, which is always constrained by patient need and consent. Those are the two poles that we have this conversation focused around. In medical discourse, then we have conditions around capacity to decide, whether there's accurate knowledge of the medical condition, etc., but those are established to provide patient choice and autonomy, not to hedge autonomy. So, secular environment does lean toward affirmation of personal responsibility and choice and recognizes there are limits to that choice. I turn then to the religious moral context. Let me do this first. Know that I'm speaking here only about the Christian religion for two reasons. One, because that's going to be the worldview of 70 to 90% of the patients you serve. It's probably the worldview of 70 to 90% of the patients in this room. Secondly, it's really the only religion I have any confidence that I'm competent to speak with authority about. If you want to understand other religions' perspective on pregnancy termination, invite one of them. And it's in the air we breathe. You talk with a person from an Asian country who practiced Buddhism there, and they come here and try to practice Buddhism. I have been told by numerous folk, it's just not the same. The American culture changes it. And the American culture, to one pole, is driven by the Christian religion. So it's not to minimize, it's not to say that others don't matter, it's not to say there's not wisdom to be found in others. I believe all of those things to be true. But it is to say, this is the driver for most of us. And furthermore, I will focus specifically and focally on United Methodists, which is its own brand of being Christian and has certain consequences. Remember, we're a conference-related unit of the United Methodist Church. They are one of our primary stakeholders. Though theirs is not the only voice in religion that matters, it is a voice that really does matter. And thus we have to pay attention. I'll be referring to some documents the United Methodist Church has. Some of you have been influenced by the Roman Catholic healthcare directives, either personally or through the media. The Methodist statements do not have the same character as the Roman Catholic healthcare directives. Roman Catholic healthcare directives are mandatory upon institutions which are affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church, and they are expected to guide the conscience of any individual Roman Catholic. The United Methodist documents are meant to inform for individual choice of how to proceed. They're very different documents with very different purposes, so please don't get confused with that. So let me begin again with the public. This is a poll from early in 2011. It asked the question, should abortion be available? You have then on this slide, and these are the positive, yes, it should be available. If you go to the far end down there, white mainline churches are those that would include United Methodists, most Lutherans, Disciples of Christ, Presbyterian USA, Episcopal, United Church of Christ, among others. And you see there's a strong yes, it should. Then we have Catholics. Interestingly enough, Catholics had to be broken out for the purposes of this survey into two separate groups. 58% of white Catholics say yes, should be available. 38% of Hispanic Catholics or Latinos say yes, it should be. By the way, for those of you who serve pregnant women, this should be a key to watching for moral distress among your patients. There are differences among Roman Catholics and how they approach this challenge. And then there are evangelicals. Evangelicals would be grouped like most Baptists, Assemblies of God, Reformed churches, independent Christian churches, Presbyterian PCA, Seventh-day Adventists. Those group would be usually those that would be white evangelical. What I want to call your attention to here is two things. First of all, whatever the teachings, the official teachings that these churches give to their parishioners, folk decide what they want to decide. Just to say someone is Roman Catholic, you have no idea what their beliefs and practices there are related to anything, much less to abortion. Just because someone is an evangelical, even as this, there are still a third of evangelicals who say, yes, abortion should be available. There has been some conversation in our midst that divides those who participate in abortions from Christians. I hope this knocks that in the head immediately. There are Christians who support abortion. There are Christians who do not support abortion. And I hope that this gets that very, very clear. It's even more nuanced than that. This slide, the blue is, I support abortion under all circumstances, and then going up in most. Well, I'm not sure, not possible in most, not possible in all. So please note that within each group, there is huge difference between those. That in every group, there are those who will say, well, abortion should not be possible in any circumstance, and there are those who say it should be possible in all circumstances. There is not a public action that is unified by religious teaching. It simply does not exist. There are official teachings, but those do not guide parishioner choice in every circumstance. You might argue in most. What about specific circumstances? If you notice, almost 90% will agree that if a woman's physical health is endangered, abortion should be available to her. You go across the spectrum of things to the very end, where it says if she does not want to marry the man, there are still 39% who say, yes, it should be possible just for that reason. And these are religious folk. And, by the way, is this really important? Well, these religious folks say, no, there are some things that are really much more important in this world than this problem. Economic justice is more important. Immigration and treatment of the stranger is more important. Abortion's on the list, it's important, but there are other things which are more important. My point that I want you to hear in this is that that persons make individual choices that need to be guided and need to be developed in terms of why they hold those decisions. Now, we have a specific guiding factor here, and it's called the United Methodist Church. We'll not give a long history here at this point, but just to be clear, that the Methodists grew out of a movement led by John Wesley. The broader term for Methodists and other related groups is the Wesleyan tradition. John Wesley, by the way, take note of when he lived. The Enlightenment. He was a minister within the Anglican tradition in England. He decided that tradition was not attending deeply enough to individual piety and individual, quote, holy living, end quote. And thus he began to minister in some unique ways. He died an Anglican clergyman. He had no intention of starting a new church. It was his following generation that established a new church. John Wesley's interest was that the urban poor and the disenfranchised people on the American frontier. He ministered in both the urban poor of England and on the American frontier. And by the way, for those of you who might not know, he was also a lay physician. He wrote one of the earliest books on medicine written in America. There was actually a guide for lay medicine for 100 years. Now, you probably wouldn't use it today. One of his prescriptions is that if you want to grow more hair, just massage some beer into your scalp regularly and you'll grow more hair. Not exactly evidence-based practice. But my point is, Wesley was concerned with how does religion contribute to the entire life of persons. And Methodists, since that day, have been very concerned in meeting social needs and in meeting medical needs. It's core to who Methodists are. And so, in the book of Discipline, which is kind of the major theological and practical points of being United Methodists, it's the Constitution and bylaws for the United Methodist Church. There is very clear and actually extended conversation about abortion. And then in the Book of Resolutions, which is a more periodic expression of the opinions of a particular time and place, there is even more discussion of abortion. Methodists have addressed these things directly. They do inform our policies and procedures. Within the Book of Discipline, this is in tone the same as the rest of this article. This is a selected piece of a long paragraph. Our belief in the sanctity of life makes us reluctant to approve abortion, but we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of life and well-being of the mother and the unborn child. We recognize tragic, that's my emphasis, tragic conflicts of life with life that may justify abortion, and in such cases we support the legal option of abortion under proper medical procedures. Now, what this document expresses is that we live in a moral tension and ambiguity. Both the mother and the unborn child have moral standing. There's no need to try to dance on heads of pins and ask the question, or when does life really begin? You simply don't need to do that. They both have moral standing. And we live in a circumstance of having to choose. And thus the word tragic. Now, we need to be careful with the word tragic. I think that is the core pin of this understanding. Tragic, when we use it in common usage, we say, oh, there was a tragic circumstance at the state fair. What we mean is it was sad, it was an undesirable event. That's not what tragic means here. Or, if you are into the theater, you speak of tragedies, Shakespeare's tragedies, for example. Some would call Death of a Salesman a tragic drama. It describes a particular kind of theater. That's not the meaning here. This is in a theological document. It has a theological meaning. And what that meaning is rooted in is understanding that all of us are caught between two facts. On the one hand, as humans, we have choice, we have control, and we have freedom. That is a fact of human existence. And on the other hand, we live in conditions of fate, dealing with things outside of our control, with a sense of destiny that we have no choice in. The human condition is bounded by those two facts. Tragic is the condition that we are in when we must choose between those two dimensions of human existence. To be very specific, a mother who does not want to parent a child with genetic deformities may or may not come to love and care for that child deeply. She is faced with a tragic choice between what she wants and what that child may become. A family who does not have resources to care for quadruplets may be gifted with community resources to help support them, or they may not. They have to make a tragic choice around their capacity and those children. Choice is that which is in my control. It is freedom. We have the ability to actually change our destinies and to push back our limits. The choices are made in the face of uncertainty. The choice I make today changes the future, but I do not know how. I cannot know how. And yet, I must choose. The United Methodist document says that's the position of a mother, a pregnant mother, having to choose between a child who may or may not be born and her own decision. Tragic choices are never between good and evil. Between good and evil, that's not difficult. It is between good and a competing good that tragic choices occur. When powers collide that are independent of each other, tragedy is the result. Theologian Reinhold Niebuhr in 1938 quoted a philosopher, Nicholas Brezhnev. This is the quote: "The most tragic situations in life are between values that are equally noble and lofty." What this statement of the United Methodist Church is saying, there are competing values here that are equally noble and lofty. And yet, we must decide. That focus is important. It moves this out of the realm of who is right and who is wrong to the realm of how can we better understand this situation that we are caught in here. And from there, better, more community-based decisions are possible. Tragedy reminds each of us that we cannot live with certainty in this life because every situation is indeed ambiguous. If you want certainty in life, then you need to go to a different universe. It ain't in this one, friends. We always have constraints, and the human spirit is always seeking self-transcendence. We're always caught between necessity and possibility, and we must choose where to go on that path. It is not an easy path to decide. And that is whether I'm a 17-year-old trying to decide where I will go to college, a 20-year-old trying to decide, well, what will I really major in, or a 45-year-old saying, well, since I've gotten here, what the hell do I do now? She knows she gets that started, I'm going to start preaching instead of lecturing, and then it's all over. In the face of uncertainty, we all must make choices. How do we decide in the midst of abortion? For Methodists, the key to moral decision-making is acting responsibly in the face of competing demands. This requires individual moral discernment, wise medical information, sensitive pastoral counsel, and the support of a loving community. It's what Methodists call grace. Now, that's a conversation for another day, but I want to name that. What else have Methodists said? Oops, forgot I had this slide. These are the controversies. So on one side, control, freedom. On the other side, fate, tragic disposition of a person caught. What else have they said? We reject the simplistic answers to the problem of abortion. On one hand, regard all abortions as murders, or on the other hand, regard abortions as medical procedures without moral significance. Abortion matters, and we must deal with that struggle. Hello? Why am I not going forward here? Ah, there it is. Okay. When an unacceptable pregnancy occurs, a family, and most of all the pregnant woman, is confronted with the need to make a difficult decision. We believe the continuance of a pregnancy that endangers the life or health of the mother or causes other severe problems concerning the life, health, or mental capability of the child is not a moral necessity. In such cases, we believe the path of mature Christian judgment may indicate the advisability of abortion. Notice that last sentence, mature Christian judgment may advise abortion. May. It may. We therefore encourage our churches and common society. And by the way, notice what the chapter this is in the Book of Resolutions. You see, this is under the chapter Responsible Parenthood. This is about parenthood and being responsible as a parent. Among the things that Methodists encourage churches and common society to do is safeguard legal options for abortion, understand standards of sound medical practice, and to make abortions available to women without regard to socioeconomic standards of sound medical practice, and make abortions available to women without regard to economic status. So what's the implication? What are the results of this? We have policies which respond to human need in a culture torn by conflicted social ethic. United Methodists support us having a discerning culture that works with mothers and, when mothers wish, family members and their authority folk to make choices for themselves. So what a professional further say, so if we did not provide abortions to those in medical need, we would be out of step with both of our institution sponsors. If we did not recognize and counsel for the serious moral implications of abortion decisions, we would be out of step with both of our sponsors. If we did not educate physicians, nurses, chaplains, and others in proper responses to persons considering abortion, we would be out of step with our sponsors. If we did not respect the differences between patients and between healthcare providers, we would be out of step with our sponsors. These are matters that go deeply to the heart of who we are. So, finally, what are our responsibilities? Well, since I've had other public opinion polls, let me have one more here. It has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but I thought it was a really cute poll. Basically, it asked, do you approve of God's performance? And by the way, this is a real poll with real polling techniques. This isn't a joke. They went out. As you look at how many people approve of God's performance, I think our president should take some comfort in this because he's only slightly less approved of than God. Like I say, it really doesn't have anything to do with the topic, but it's important. So, what we have is a necessity of conscience. Professionals, we've been talking about women and choice and the complicated fact they find themselves in. You and I are also in the same condition of humanity. We too face tragic choices. And how we position ourselves in relationship to those desiring and needing abortion is one of my tragic choices and one of your tragic choices. There's 3 ways that we can position ourselves. Give you a fact. A 2011 article in one of the professional journals reported that 97% of OBs receive requests for abortions. However, only 14% are willing to provide abortions. Tragic difference. Perhaps needing attention by educational institutions. Any moral stance must begin with the presumption that life, at a minimum, requires respect and protection. None of us are in the business of eliminating life. I assure you that on no one scorecard is there a incentive for increasing abortions provided. It's just not there. We dare not desensitize ourselves to the meaning and value of life of any and all developmental levels, whether prenatal or elder on deathbed. From this perspective, abortion should be the last choice to be explored, a choice that becomes relevant when the facts of existence and the choices available in the face of those choices leads the patient to this conclusion. Whatever you find yourself on this spectrum we've been describing, recommit yourself to that place. There are 3 positions. One is conscientious engagement, to provide abortion services with conscience, with compassion, and with skill. In my opinion, and this is my opinion, we need more providers willing to do so and to deal with the stigma that some in society have branded persons with providing a valuable and a desired service, at least in some way, an option that 80% of the population thinks should be available to women. We need providers willing to be there. Conscientious objection. We have laws and we have policies so that we cannot and will not force persons to participate in procedures to which they have moral and religious objection. There's a danger present, however, if such objections threaten the standard of care for a patient. Consent to care is the prerogative of the patient, thus clear information, availability of referral, and evidence-based medical practice are not matters of conscience. They are simply matters of what physicians must provide. We will continue to honor conscientious objection. A small charge here. For those of you who find within your religious tradition the grounding for conscientious objection, I applaud that and I support that. And I hope you are as conscientious about other areas of your faith tradition's teachings as you are about this one. Then there is conscientious obligation. For those who follow conscience and on either side of this, the question is, How do we be faithful to the standards we have set? What is the obligation? I would like to suggest, particularly for those who are toward the end of conscientious objection, but not exclusively, because I think this applies in engagement. If you object, then how are you addressing the situation? I grew up during the Vietnam War. I was one of those folk who would have had my number drawn to go to Vietnam. I missed it by 3 numbers in the random draw. During the Vietnam War, where all of society was at risk of going to Vietnam, conscientious objection to going to war was supported. But what did persons who took conscientious objection have to do? Alternative service. For those who take a conscientious step, I would suggest that conscientious obligation to alternative service, not simply to not be engaged, but to engage in a different way, to go to low-income health clinics and teach teenagers about how not to get pregnant. If you're one who refuses to participate in abortion for patients whose child has a genetic anomaly, then how are you engaged in the community and with those patients to increase the resources to those families so they can actually care for those children? Rather than saying, no, you can't have the abortion, and good luck raising that child. I'm suggesting there's a conscientious obligation for those of us who may support abortion to help be involved in matters to reduce it as far as possible and to ensure that it is as safe medically as possible. I hope that addresses each and every one of those. For those of you who may still be in training, I urge you to seriously consider learning all procedures that you have available to you to learn. Today there are referral options, but those are limited and they are aging people. In 10 years, if you have not been trained to provide these procedures, there may well be no options available, not because of law or because of ethic, but because you have not been trained. These are matters of professional development and judgment that are very important. So, to conclude, we value meeting the medical needs of women with priority given to their informed consent. We value sustaining the integrity of our patients as whole persons. We honor both tragedy and ambiguity. We educate medical practitioners to provide safe and ethical abortions. We support conscientious objection and encourage conscientious obligation. And we require respect and trust be expressed toward coworkers within the healthcare community. I've taken up pretty well all the airspace here. We do have just a couple of minutes. Since this is on the air, if you have a question, would welcome you going to the microphone and speaking. And I will be here as long as anyone wants to talk with me. I will be here. Does anyone wish to make a comment or ask a question?